Let's welcome back to the Games Institute Jason Hawreliak, who is, yes, please. Jason defended his PhD here at Waterloo, was it 2013?
Yep.
In 2013, under Marcelo Gorman, supervisor. It was the first dissertation we had, certainly in English, but one of the first certainly at the university about game studies itself. He looked at death, as I recall.
Yeah, among other things, yeah.
Yeah. That most fascinating topic is how it's almost impossible to die in video games, but actually a lot more than that, rhetoric of death and all those sorts of things. I will mention that for those of you who have been paying attention, Jason is one of the founders of First Person Scholar, and I think was in that first meeting. I'm trying to remember. Kent Arthur was in a meeting. I think it was you or Michael, one or the other. One of you was in that damn meeting. I think it was a Tuesday afternoon in my office over in Navy Hall. And I'm trying to remember who it is ever since, when we actually started First Person Scholar. So started with your work, and you went on to become a professor at Brock University. It's and the program is game design.
Yeah, there's the Center for Digital Humanities. There's a few programs there.
All right, so congratulations on that, by the way.
Thank you.
And has now very recently published Multimodal Semiotics and Rhetoric in Video Games, which I encourage you to all go out and get in order to put under the tree at an upcoming celebration. All right?
Thank you very much.
Congratulations and welcome back, and you're going to tell us what's going on here and also about teaching in a design program.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Neil, and thanks everybody for coming. It's great to be back. I'm back every year or so or two here at the GI, and it's great to see new faces and how it's changing. So I'm going to talk today about some of the material in the book, and then later on have more of an informal discussion about some of the things that I've learned teaching in a dedicated games program for the last 4 years over at Brock. There's not a lot of games programs certainly in the province. There's only a handful. Laurier, as many of you know, Steve Wilcox is over at Laurier. York has a concentration. That's about it at the university level. There's lots of game stuff happening in like English departments, but dedicated games programs are pretty rare. I think that's going to change. So I just want to talk a little bit about my experiences there, and maybe for those getting ready to go on the job market in a few years, maybe some tips on how to apply for jobs in that department. So yeah, I'm at Brock. I'm an assistant professor of game studies. There's my Twitter, if anybody wants to follow me there. I'm not great at Twitter, but if you want to follow me, that's fine. So the basic question I had coming out of my dissertation, which really, I guess at the end of the day, was about how video games are really good conveyors of ideology and can serve as propaganda. And death and heroism was kind of woven into that. But at the end of my dissertation, I remember feeling very dissatisfied with some very basic questions. So I was talking about how games are propaganda, but how do games signify in the first place? This is really, it's a very fundamental question. I was in my 5th year of my PhD and was hoping to get it done quickly, so I kind of put that on the back burner. And that's really been my focus of my work for the last few years anyways. So the challenge is, how do games signify in general? So not just for a specific genre or type of games, but for every type of game you can think of. Indie, AAA, strategy games, first-person shooters, role-playing games, et cetera, et cetera. Is there something that connects all of them? Because as we all know, games are varied and we can make basically anything into a game. But is there some way that we can look at this question in a holistic way? And I should say now that I'm focusing on video games, but I think a lot of what I'm going to present here today would apply to analog games. My students make a lot of analog games. I'm a strong proponent of paper prototyping, so I think it applies. But video games are just a very rich medium, and it's what I'm familiar with, so that's my focus. Okay. So the basic argument. Meaning in video games comes from multiple sources simultaneously. Each source contributes to meaning in its own way. So nothing too controversial there. I think we'd all agree with that. T.L. Taylor's Assemblage of Play makes this argument in like 6 pages. It's fantastic. Ghost Unit Operations. There's lots of people who deal with games and complexity. Since I'm interested in meaning, I'm looking at this from the perspective of semiotics and rhetoric. So in what sort of ways do games convey meaning? Well, we have text. Text is often thought of, I think, as a historically significant way to convey information. We obviously had text adventures, but even, this is the Elder Scrolls Online. We need text to convey certain types of information, whether it's lore, dialogue, user interface uses text, inventory systems, title screens. Text is still important. And text is good at communicating certain kinds of information that other ways of communication, like, I don't know, music or image, aren't. Right? Text is really good at lore, for example. Trying to communicate lore into music or something would be very difficult. I wouldn't know how to do that exactly. Okay. There's image. Here's from the new Cowboy game that's out. So beautiful environments, characters. How are characters represented? How are environments represented? This is something that we have to look at as well. Sound effects, right, and music. Music, of course, is a very emotional way to communicate information. It's great at evoking emotions and atmosphere and mood and all those sorts of things. Haptics, something I'm becoming increasingly interested in. I don't know if any of you remember the Rumble Pack from the N64, but that was my first experience with haptic feedback. And it's gotten a lot more complex and I think interesting since then. So does anybody recognize what that is? Has anybody seen the Kickstarter for that? So that's called the Tesla suit, not by Elon Musk, but it basically has these 68 haptic points, and it's really meant not just for gaming, but for everything, like VR applications, maybe even augmented reality applications. And the idea here is that it's not just haptic feedback or tactile feedback in your hands, but all over your body. The way that this works, usually there's a rumble. This works kind of like the same principle if you've ever gone to physiotherapy and there's little electrodes. It's kind of that same principle. So all sorts of applications, both within and outside of games. Whether something like this will take off or not, I'm not sure. I'm always kind of skeptical about these things, but the technology is certainly there. Another way is procedurality. So we know about procedurality in game studies very well for 20 years. Janet Murray, Hamlet on the Holodeck was talking about it. Then a little later, Boggos and procedural rhetoric. Rules have their own way of representing the world. Right? We can represent the world through rule systems. Here I have a civilization progress tree. Right? There's obviously an implicit argument being made there about progress. And on the other slide is I worked with local high school students who in 6 weeks, with no prior experience, made board games from scratch. And it was really impressive. They had to involve it in their curriculum. They were looking at careers. So this game here, you had to get references and then go on to an interview and then pass an interview and then get a job. And just in there, they were making some really interesting arguments about getting a job. For instance, you can do everything right, but at the end of the day, those interviews were still based largely on dice rolls. So there's still some luck involved, which is how getting a job works. Paratext and context, so things like marketing. We all remember the Call of Duty and Activision marketing campaigns where they spent upwards of $100 million or more just on their marketing. That influences how we understand games once we get to them. Something like hype, right, from No Man's Sky, or another example, a game that I really like, and I'm almost alone in this, is Mass Effect Andromeda, which I thought was a pretty fun game. Widely panned by critics and BioWare fans, but I think for myself, I came in with fairly low expectations for Mass Effect Andromeda, and it's a pretty fun space opera game. So, what's the press leading into something? What's the press as a game is being released? So, Red Dead Redemption 2, while playing it, it's a beautiful game. It's difficult not to think about the sort of exploitative labor practices that went into making all the animations look so pretty. So even though that's not part of the game specifically, like it's not in the executable file, that still makes its way into how the game is understood. Something more, a little more recently is Twitch and streaming. People will watch games a lot of time before buying them. And again, just being aware of something, familiar with systems before playing it will influence how we ultimately come to understand the game. The next one's the tricky one that makes semiotic and rhetorical analyses very difficult. and that's the players themselves. So you have all this complexity with art and sound and rules, and then on top of that, we have players who each player comes with their own experiences, their own preferences. Maybe somebody has a headache or indigestion or something. That's going to influence how they understand and interpret a game. So this is a picture from the Level Up Student Showcase, where basically most of the undergraduate games programs in Ontario, both at the college and university level, will come and show off their games. Last year there were, I believe, 80 games from about a dozen institutions. It's open to the public down at the Design Exchange in Toronto. It gets usually about 2,000 to 3,000 people through. So although all those people that come through to play these different games all come in with their own experiences. So when we're thinking about, well, what does a scene in Red Dead Redemption 2 mean? Well, that's a very difficult question when you have to take into account all this player variance. So the basic argument then, right, the basic question is, how do games signify? That's a big question. Where I'm going to focus then, and where I focused in this book, is in semiotic modes, which are basically just different ways to communicate information. So not included here is gesture. So obviously on the Nintendo Wii, and there's gestural controls. Most of the VR platforms now have gesture. There's things like color and layout. There's other semiotic modes as well, but I tend to focus on these ones here. Players aren't really, I do certainly account for the players in the game, in the book, excuse me, but they're more of like, okay, here's how they're difficult, and here's how we can mitigate the problem with players and how much complexity they bring. Paratext, I just have an asterisk there because paratext is usually multimodal. If we think of like commercials, they're multimodal websites. Okay, so multimodality is just a social semiotic framework that allows us to analyze how semiotic modes, so I'm just going to return back to, so how all these different modes work together within an ensemble to create potential meanings. And the metaphor of the ensemble works really well, I think, where the conductor is maybe the developer, or developers are the creative director or something. But if we think about all the different instruments in an ensemble, you have a brass section, you have some trombones there and some clarinets. Well, if you remove just one section, if we took out the trombones and put in a recorder or something, well, that's going to change the way that the whole orchestra sounds, how the whole ensemble sounds. The song, the track is going to fundamentally change. And that's a really fundamental principle of multimodality, is that all the different modes in an ensemble influence each other. And as soon as you start swapping them in and out, then you get vastly different potential interpretations. Okay? So that's multimodality, and I just want to draw attention to the social semiotic part of that, because again, taking into account the material conditions under which something is produced, taking into account cultural norms, the way that people communicate with each other, all these things are really important, and multimodality lets us account for that a little bit. So within multimodal configurations, there's basically two. These can be broken down, but the first is consonants. This is just all modes reinforce each other. They basically say the same thing. Okay? Now this is the default. This is what we usually teach in our game design programs. We want everything to kind of come together, right? So the music should reinforce the art style, the gameplay should reinforce both, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So outside of games, right, a scary movie, Michael Myers is chasing somebody, you have some tense visuals on screen, that's moving image, and then you usually have some tense music to reinforce that. Okay. Dissonance, on the other hand, is just the opposites. This is when two or more modes within an ensemble will conflict with each other, maybe outright contradict each other, either aesthetically or rhetorically. So same scene, take out the creepy music in Halloween and put in yakety sax or something silly like that, and all of a sudden Michael Myers doesn't seem so scary anymore. Right? The moving image has stayed exactly the same, but we've changed the music, or even in scary movies, if you mute the music, all of a sudden the way that we interpret that scene changes fundamentally. So the same thing happens in games. Games are just much more multimodal, so they allow for some more complex configurations here. Okay, so I want to look at a couple of examples, and hopefully this will play. So Skyrim, I think, is a really good example of where they use all the modes kind of come together to create this one experience. So, I mean, it's like a 7-year-old game, so sorry for spoilers. You fight a big dragon at the end. So I just want you to pay attention to kind of everything that's going on at once, especially the way the visuals and some text, how they all kind of work together to give you this feeling of being in a big battle. So you just notice the sky, there's, something clearly magical happening. Okay, the music kicks in, these. So you have the speech. And always that interruption there with RPGs of, going into the mirror, going into the menu. So you sort of get the idea there, right? Everything's kind of going together, right? Everything kind of comes all to this one epic feeling, all right? So I think I've shown this to a couple people before, so apologies, but this is my favorite example of dissonance in Skyrim, which is from a mod. So here someone swapped out the dragon skin for Thomas the Tank Engine. I think Percy and the other pals are there too. So just watch here. So the dragon takes off, and what's interesting here is that Thomas is just as dangerous as the regular dragons. Okay, so Thomas shoots fire or ice if it's an ice dragon. The damage that Thomas deals is the same as a dragon. All right, and the damage that he can withstand is the same, right? But obviously here with I don't know how well you can hear, but there's that toot toot and the visuals. It's hard to take this seriously, right? The developers probably wanted this to be a really scary, awe-inspiring fight, and that's not what we have here at all. Okay, and again, all that's changed there is the visual mode, so the moving image, and sound effects a little bit. Okay, so those have changed, and now that battle, which can be quite not terrifying, but it's certainly a little anxiety-inducing, especially when early on, that becomes something that's actually pretty silly just by swapping out the modes. So there you have some dissonance, right? That's the other configuration. Another example is from Battlefield 1. There's a scene in one of the early campaigns where you go from some really intense battle to controlling a carrier pigeon, which is very serene music playing while there's a really chaotic battle happening below. So this is a really great way to produce irony or tension, right? With this juxtaposition of modes where I have this very calm music and this very chaotic battle happening before. Movies do this all the time, right? Action movies do that a lot. Where I started on this whole thing, one of the reasons was because I really liked the idea of ludonarrative dissonance. Okay, a lot of people hate it, but I really enjoyed it. I think it was really getting at something, but it was just a little clunky. And a lot of people made that argument. But I really like this idea of parts not quite working, and that can sometimes be bad. Lana Polanski comes along in, I think, 2015 and writes a really great short blog post about coherence and incoherence, where her basic argument is it doesn't matter if something is dissonant or not, it's is it coherent? And I thought, well, that's getting a little bit closer. What I think a multimodal framework does is it allows us to look at different types of tension between all these different modes. So, saying story and gameplay, those are a little clunky. Well, maybe we can say the visual modes and the auditory modes, maybe those work together in some interesting ways, or the procedural modes, the rules, maybe those can, it gives a little more refined way to look at how component parts work together. So, James Paul G wrote, "There's no other more multimodal media today than video games," and I think that's right. So video games can really take any mode that we can use for representation, and they can incorporate them. So what does this mean? One of the arguments I want to make is that video games at least have the potential to represent things and experiences in more ways than other media. Now, this isn't to say better than other media, but more ways than other media. But conceivably, if you had really good developers who, had lots and lots of experience in their specific disciplines and modes, you could maybe present something that's really powerful. Doesn't always happen, or doesn't even happen very often, but it's potential. So I want to give an example of an application of a multimodal framework and how it works in analysis in one of my favorite games last couple of years, MAFIA 3. Okay? So, and then just a content warning here that MAFIA 3 deals with some racism and I think a really interesting way. So MAFIA 3 is set in 1968 in basically New Orleans, but they call it New Bordeaux. If you're not familiar with the series, it's kind of like a Grand Theft Auto style gameplay. You play as Lincoln Clay, a Vietnam veteran who wants to take on the mob. There's a whole kind of revenge story there. This is the first installment in the series which has a person of color as the playable character, at least that I'm aware of. Yeah. So that's the setting. Okay. The Deep South in the U.S., you play as a black man. So already there's clearly going to be something to say there. Right? So Charles Webb, who's one of the senior writers, or the senior writer, on the game, wrote, "One of the things I'm really proud of is we've kind of created this game of empathy. This is what it was like to occupy this space as this particular type of person as a young black man in 1968 in the South." Austin Walker, Waypoint, who many of you may be familiar with his work, he has a really great article on how MAFIA 3 tackles racism, where it falls short in some ways, but some of the things that it does in a really interesting way, and I think in a way that hasn't been done in other games that deal with similar topics. Or I think more often than not, when video games try to tackle something like racism or sexism, they often fall flat and get it wrong, often because of a lack of care. And I think that MAFIA 3, they do at least some things right. So we get this basically multimodal representation of white supremacy and oppressive systems. Okay? We get it through text. So in some buildings, Lincoln isn't allowed in, and if I were to enter this building, all of a sudden the owner will call the police, and Lincoln can be arrested or potentially killed if you don't leave right away. Okay, so it's reinforced through text. There's racist speech you hear. Okay, you hear on the radio while driving the car sometimes, some slurs while walking, and the cutscenes are just kind of casually dropped as well. So in speech, the area where I think is really interesting and I think different is through the procedural mode, through rules. So here, I don't know how well you can read that, but basically, depending on which part of the city you're in, the police response will differ. So in the affluent white neighborhoods, the police response will be very quick. Okay, so if you, hit somebody with a car or shoot a gun or whatever, the police response time will be very quick. In the poorer black neighborhoods, not so much. Okay? So just by, if you were to be making the game, there's certain areas where there's different rules apply. And I think games might be a really good way to explore things like that. Okay? So one of the lead developers writes, "There are places where if Lincoln looks out of place and seems out of place, people, like pedestrians and non-playable characters, will react to that. There are places you can go that just being there is an offense and will elicit a police response." So I think this is a very different way to treat systemic racism than just reading about it or watching it in a film. This is, again, not doing it necessarily a better way, but doing it in its own way. So players interact with and experience a simulated model of an oppressive, prejudicial, and deadly system. So this is an affordance unique to interactive media, I think. The way that I approach multimodal analyses is to basically make these charts. right away, so you can just see how they all kind of come together. This would be an example of modal consonants, right? Everything's kind of coming together. It might be clear though, right away, one of the challenges is you have to know a little bit about each type of signification system to do a multimodal analysis. You have to know a little bit about, aesthetic theory, you know a little bit about textual analysis, speech, design and procedurality, music. Karen Collins, still at Waterloo, I believe, is the guru of game sound and music. And that is a super technical, difficult field that takes years and years of study. So it's very difficult to be an expert in all of these different modalities. So you just what I found is I just rely on the experts and kind of try to put things together. So based on this multimodal analysis, I can say MAFIA 3 presents a multimodal model of white supremacy. The procedural mode allows game designers to express systemic oppression in novel ways. And this is what I'm interested in, and what I'll talk about in a minute about teaching is I strongly believe that being a good theorist and analyst can make good game designers. Okay, I think having a contextual background and some theoretical knowledge can help make good designers. On the opposite end, I think that being familiar with the design process, the development process, can help make us better game studies theorists and analysts. All right? So in the book, I really try to walk both lines and say, well, here's how this can be useful to both people like me, like academics and humanities, who are researchers and also game designers potentially. So just last thing I want to say about multimodality is the future direction I'm really interested in is olfaction, which is smell, and gustation or taste. So in the 50s and 60s, they tried in movie theaters to have smell-o-vision, I guess. So you'd be watching a movie and I don't know, there's somebody with strong perfume or cologne and they'd put that into the theater. Didn't go very well, as you might imagine. So they kind of scrapped that. But there are some technologies which come out of psychiatry, which might be useful for game development. So here I have a picture of Skip Rizzo from USC. He treats combat veterans coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan who suffer from PTSD. And what the research coming out of that lab found was one way to treat PTSD is through what's called exposure therapy. And this is basically a way to simulate the traumatic event, like for example, running into an improvised explosive device, and simulating that in a safe environment. One of the things they use is smell. So to fully recreate the environment, they have like cordite and gunpowder, the smell of that, through these little canisters that they can release in a pretty controlled way. Okay? Still probably not controlled enough for a consumer environment. Potentially the whole room might stink. But they're controlled by a computer, by like a little USB device, and so the technology is at least conceivably there where we might be able to start working with olfaction in interesting ways. So a hypothetical example I put in the book is, well, if The Witcher 3, which I was playing a lot while writing it, if there's a certain area that has like a flower that only grows in this certain area, well, maybe that flower could have a scent, and you could use that for Geralt to go off and find something. Right? The other side is the gustatory mode. So this already exists. Like Lord of the Rings, people make lembas and like all sorts of things. World of Warcraft has this official cookbook. It's where you can kind of make dishes that are associated with World of Warcraft. All right. So I don't know how this would work exactly, but maybe if somebody takes a swig of a drink or eat something, maybe you could cook something ahead of time and do it that way. There actually are devices that can simulate taste that are being worked on right now in labs. I'm a little wary of that. If something goes wrong there, if there's electrodes on my tongue, I'm not too comfortable with that. But again, the technology is there. So I'm kind of interested, I guess, in these underexplored modes. When in the multimodal research, these are listed all the time, like as just examples, but they're kind of under-theorized. So I'm sort of interested in where we can go with this. Astrid Ensslin has written about these modes, I think probably the most in terms of multimodality. So that's more if you want to check it out. So that's multimodality. Happy to answer questions after or talk about it after. But I just want to quickly talk about teaching in a dedicated games program. And one of the reasons I want to discuss this today was that I think there's going to be more of these going forward. They're very attractive. In our own program, we have 50 spots, 25 for a design stream, 25 for a programming stream. We get between 350 and 400 applications a year. And that's been consistent for the last 3 years. So games are obviously an exciting area of study. We all love to play them, and we all want to know more about them. So I think that this is going to start coming up. But there are some unique advantages and challenges, I think, for teaching in a dedicated games program. When I was doing my PhD here, I was researching games. I was teaching technical writing and introductory rhetoric and things that had really nothing to do with games. You know, I found ways to include games in those courses, but that wasn't the whole point of the program. And even you know, in an English department, you probably can't get away from teaching, you know, traditional English courses. It's just the way that it is. Okay? So one of the unique things about our program is that it's joint with Niagara College. So in 4 years, the students get either a BA in game design or a BSc in game programming from Brock, in addition to an advanced diploma in game development from Niagara College. Okay? So I can see why this was envisioned long before I got to Brock, but you can see kind of the appeal right away, right? You get the hands-on technical know-how of the college and then the theoretical rigor of a university. So how does this link with research? And this is just a little poster that my students made last year. They have to do some marketing along with making games. Part of the way I see it most is there's a 4th-year capstone course, which I've taught for the last few years. And the idea is that students are usually in groups of 10 to 15, and we say, okay, make a game. Don't give them much else, to be honest. We guide them throughout the process, but they have 7 months to make an original game from scratch, which they will then present at Level Up, that picture of all the people I showed you. Okay, so that's the goal. Most of them aren't going to grad school, so they're not even that concerned about grades at this point. It's just really about putting on a good show in public. Okay, so what really started to click for me was, you know, we teach in game design programs, we teach all these different skills that require completely different ways of thinking. Okay, so being a good artist requires a very different skill set from being a sound designer or musician, which is obviously very different from being a programmer, being a narrative, or being a designer. I mean, game designers kind of do everything. They hold everything together. But that too is its own skill set. Right? So I started to think, well, this is kind of the way that multimodality works. Each department is basically, you know, responsible for their own section of meaning. And so while players experience games holistically, right, I get the sound and the image and the haptics all at once. Well, that's true, but I don't think we should necessarily treat this all as one experience, right? Because when you go to make a game, it requires all these different ways to communicate information. So for me, looking at how each mode communicates its affordances is actually really useful for me as an analyst to think about how games convey meaning. The term that our students hate by February every year is conveyance, because that's always the challenge that they run into, is how do I communicate my information to players who level up. You have about 2 minutes, maybe 3. The judges will walk around and look at your game, maybe not even play it. So you have to, if you want to make a game from level up, you have to catch people's attention very quickly. And really the challenge comes down to communication and conveyance. So some advantages. This is a Juxtaposition, which was a cool game. It won 2nd place in People's Choice Level Up last year, 2017. Okay. So some advantages. I get to talk about games all the time. That's great. Okay. I enjoyed talking about Cicero and Quintilian in my Intro to Rhetoric class and Aristotle, but that's not what I'm mostly passionate about. Right? I'm passionate about game studies, and so that's what I get to do. Likewise, the students are motivated. Okay, so for any of us who have taught technical writing or grammar, the students aren't always that into it. Okay, the students are almost always into this. Okay, so I have to cut. Like I have a 2-hour lecture that almost always I have to cut off because students are really chatty and they want to talk about these things. Right? The student projects change every year. So whether it's an essay or a game they make, nothing. I never get bored. Nothing's ever stale. We can discuss issues they might not discuss in a purely technical program like a college program where they might learn some game design, but really if they're going to be programmers, they're learning mostly about game programming. Well, we can talk about things like gender and race and labor in my classes, and that's not always possible in other venues. My teaching and research, like I said, continually inform each other. So I learn from my students all the time through discussions with them. We talk about things, and they teach me as well, and this is kind of that two-way street, so that's a really strong advantage. Okay? There are some challenges too, though. The one that I've found, and I'm not that surprised, is especially in the first year or two, we really have to sell to them the value of game studies and some of these contextual competencies and literacies. So, why do I have to discuss feminism? I just want to make a game. I just want to learn Unity and Maya or 3ds Max and get into it. Okay? So they really are caught up in wanting to be tool experts, which for me anyways, a good game developer should be a lot more than just a tool expert. Okay? That's only one side of things. So keeping them engaged early on is a challenge. I will say very happily that by the upper years, 3rd and 4th, it starts to click. They start to say, oh, okay, I get it, usually. Fluctuations in the job market and labor issues. So, we all know, working in academia is not a sure thing at all. Well, the games industry is kind of the same. And even if it is, even AAA studios are moving more and more to contract work. We've heard, what's happened with Rockstar and all these sorts of different things. So, trying to balance their expectations, giving them the best shot to finding work when they get out, but also, managing expectations. It's very difficult, even 4 years, 2 institutions, you can't do everything. So like in our program, one thing we're kind of weak on is sound design. Right? Most of the students, they take a course or 2 in sound design, but some of the tools just take a lot of tinkering with, and we just don't have the time for that. So we're really strong especially the BSCs, obviously in programming and design and art, but not so much in sound, and it's just because something's got to give. Students definitely get stressed. We see that because they're publicly presenting their work, and this is creative stuff that I can't just like work harder and it's going to work out. These are we all know doing anything creative is difficult. They get stressed, especially Level Up is in April. Around March, you should really start to see them getting stressed out. We do everything we can to mitigate crunch. Our game jams people don't stay overnight. Like we're really trying to be on top of that, but. Try telling a 22-year-old, go home, get some sleep, don't work on your game. There's only so much that we can do. Communication between disciplines. This is the number one reason why a project succeeds or fails, is communication. So the designer changes something without telling the programmer who's just been working on a system that's now obsolete for the last 2 weeks. Or narrative changes something, and now art has to change something that they made. Okay. Gender imbalance. So in the programming stream, it's very unbalanced. So it's probably like 90-10 for men versus women. The BA stream is a little better. It's probably something like 70-30, but that's not great. So how do we approach that at our level? Okay, because even at the applications, it's strongly skewed towards men. So we work with the K-12 schools, try to get them interested in games. What can we do? Because by the time they get to post-secondary, a lot of times it's too late. A lot of those gender norms have been reinforced. You hear students say in my computer science class in high school, I was the only girl. So how do we get that more on track? I didn't think this would happen, but getting them to play the games we assign. So it's like reading. Like I guess I kind of expect it for readings, but say go play this game. It's free. You can find it online. It's the same challenge as getting them to read something. So those are some of the challenges. The last thing I'll say, and then we can open it up, is what I found for the job market is, one, being involved in something like the Games Institute is a really good first step. So the network that's here, the different types of research that you're exposed to is fantastic. Okay? So that's one step. You know, do you have to do all if you want to be an academic, you need to do all the things that academics do, like, you know, try to publish new conferences and yada yada. Okay, something that I've noticed that some of my colleagues in humanities don't like, but I've just seen it, is some sort of technical know-how, even at a very basic level. More and more schools are looking for games. If they're looking for game studies, also game studies and design. So they just want to see that you have some familiarization with a tool like Unity. So even building little prototypes can be really, really helpful. Right? Not sure it should be that way, but it's just kind of what I've seen over the last few years as these openings start up. Okay, so that's it. Thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Questions? Right, it's cold in here, right? All falling.
Questions or comments or query, complaints? Yes.
A question about your framework of multimodality.
Mm-hmm.
Is there also dynamic hierarchy between the framework, like on which parts are more important depending on the game or depending on the context of the game?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, short answer is no. So in multimodality, the idea is that it's a flat system. So all modes have the same ability to contribute. That said, because there can be so many modes in a game, what I've found is that you kind of have to just be selective. Like, I want to really look at, you know, if I want to look at gender, then I'm probably going to look at, you know, visual, auditory, and maybe systems like procedures. So you kind of have to be selective. You can't do it all. In the book, I think I tried once to do all the modes, and it was like too much. Then I say that, I'm like, I'll just show you how much it is, and then I'm not going to do it again because there's just too much to it. So I think within game studies, certainly the procedural mode, the rules, seems to be privileged. And one thing I'm hoping to do with this, introducing this framework, is say, no, that's just one among many. And it's important, but it's no more important implicitly than something like art or sound or anything else.
Thanks.
Yeah. Where's
So you mentioned something about coherence, and you gave that quote, it doesn't matter if it's dissonant or consonant as long as it's coherent.
Mhm.
I'm not really sure what you mean by that, so I'm wondering if you can give an example of like a coherent instance of dissonance.
Sure. So that's coming from Lana Polanski, and so I'm blanking on who drew it. It's like a famous art, but there's that you know, it's a drawing of a pipe, and there's some text that says in French. Yeah. Right. So there, the text and the image are dissonant. Okay, they're contradicting each other essentially. Right. I think that's still coherent because it works. Right. An example. So I'll give you an example of something that doesn't work. When you're playing Batman Arkham City, and Batman, all throughout the game, you're being told that Batman's a super strong hero, he can do all these different things. Okay, I want to go up a flight of stairs, and some police tape is blocking my way. Right? So Batman could just step over it, or right, that to me would be incoherent. It takes you out of the the diegesis. It takes me out of the experience. I think so. Like the example I showed with Battlefield 1, where it really holds together. It's the serene music, the procedural mode with you can't be killed. I don't think the pigeon is just kind of flying around. It's very like drifting. It's very peaceful and calm. And below you see this like explosions and this chaotic battlefield. And to me, what that does, it actually brings the visual mode to the fore, like puts it in relief with the calm music and the calm procedurality. So what the developers were trying to do there, I think, was juxtapose these different modes to show how chaotic and ugly war is and battle is by putting it in juxtaposition with these calm modes. So that works together. It's partly subjective, and there's no like silver bullet, I'd say, to where's that line between dissonance and incoherence. But I'd say sometimes when the parts seem to work together, and you can say, yeah, that makes sense, that still works, then it'll be coherent. I'd say. So yeah, there's no like objective answer to that, I guess I'd say, but it's just you kind of know it when you see it. Yeah.
This is sort of specific, so Do you make a distinction with students with naturalistic and abstract modalities? That are certain modes that are privilege, empiricism, or others that are sort of genre-oriented or culturally generally?
So, like, just so I understand your question, like the visual modes might be privileged in certain cultures over others, or?
Sure, I'm thinking more actually in the collaborative environment when they're making something. So you know students are suited, or they seem to draw into one or the other. Do
Right.
you sort of allow them that organization, or do you mix that up sometimes?
Oh, gotcha. So the students all self-select their roles. We're very hands-off. So that's actually brought some challenges, because in one year we had 14 students, 7 of them wanted to be narrative designers. So that ended up being a very narrative game. They had one programmer, so they couldn't do much in terms of systems. So yeah, we absolutely let them choose. We built in that they need now a second role, because narrative, for example, usually most of the work's done in the first semester. Okay, we have the narrative. We may have to do some dialogue and recording, but so they usually pitch in like QA and UX and things like that. But yeah, programming is always going to be necessary, at least for the games that we teach in our program, because we use Unity. But I will say that with something like Unity, you can get away with not being, you don't have to know a lot of math anymore. Like the engine does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So students are usually pretty willing to learn on the fly. They can find things on Google and YouTube. What we really teach them is, what are the questions I need to ask? What do I need to ask to find on Google, so that I can make my way through this. But yeah, like I'd say within the teams, everybody is more or less seen as equal. We do assign a producer or a creative director that kind of oversees everything, but they're not like the boss or anything. They're just making sure everybody's kept on track. Yeah.
Sorry, I might have missed it, but how many modalities are there, and what are these?
Yeah, so good question. There's probably a dozen or so. There's a lot of discussion over what counts as a mode, and so like some will say color is a mode. Like obviously red signifies something different from green, right?
Modality, you mean like
It's just the best definition I've heard is it's a means for making meaning. So does it have its own way to create meaning that's different from other modes? So speech has a way of communicating that's different from interpretive dance or music, right? So that's basically the only criterion. When I was writing the book, I got some pushback from the reviewers about procedurality as a mode. Are rules a mode? And what I basically had to demonstrate to them was, well, take a game like tic-tac-toe. It has a certain rule set. Well, just change one of the rules, like maybe instead of 1x or 1o per turn, you did 2x's or 2o's per turn. Well, all of a sudden that becomes a very different game. The strategies change. My understanding of how to win changes. So the meaning changes based on a change to a mode. So that's kind of how I think of it. Does it have its own unique way of conveying information, generally speaking?
so this term is only applying to like because where I know the term from modality is from psychology.
Yeah. Yeah, and stats and computer science, and yeah, every modality appears in like all these different disciplines. And a game mode, right? There's like a single player mode or a multiplayer mode. So yeah, it's this, it's this really broadly used term. In semiotics, it just basically means its own unique way of making meaning. And one of the fundamental tenets is that all communication is fundamentally multimodal. Like right now, I'm using speech, but I'm using gesture, and there's body language. There's all these other things that communicate language in their own ways. So yeah, it is kind of a weird term. I definitely get that, and I'm just using it in one context of semiotics. Yeah, Michael.
You brought up narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Narrative's got a contentious history with game studies. Does it fit well with multimodality, or is it like gameplay kind of evaporates when you hold it up to multimodality light?
Yeah.
Does narrative do the same thing? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Because narrative is usually multimodal itself. Like narrative can be through text, it can be through audiovisual modes like film, like a cinematic cutscene. So I tried to, in the book certainly, I try to get away from treating narrative as a mode, which by the way is a mode in literary studies, so more confusion. But say, well, let's not look at the narrative, let's look at how information is being conveyed. So through moving image and speech, for example, and music. So that's a good question. Narrative, I think we need to break down in a more granular way. And that was my, I guess, I didn't quite know, but that was my gripe with ludonarrative dissonance was I really like this idea, but it's just too, it's like a sledgehammer, right? It's just too broad of a way to think about it. So I think multimodality lets us look at parts in a little more granular way.
More questions? Was the program you went into at Brock, was that in place when you got there?
No, it was undergoing ministry approval as per all the marketing documents. So they hired me to work in that program. We also have another program called Interactive Arts and Science, which through student demand morphed into a game studies program. So those juxtaposition that I showed you is actually from ISC. Game is its own thing, but interactive arts and science, like we do media theory and web design and interactive museum kiosks and whatever, AR, augmented reality, virtual tours, like anything that's interactive. So we had a really good infrastructure in place. We like a lot of professionals teaching our programs, but game itself is actually just in its third year right now. So we haven't even graduated a cohort yet. It's been in the works for a long time now.
So as far as I know, it was the first one in Ontario.
Hawreliak beat it out by a year. I think they went into the ministry at the same time, if I understand it right, but Hawreliak came in like a year before.
Right. Do you know what the differences are?
Yeah, so our program is basically for students who want to work in either the AAA industry or start their own indie studio or work in the indie. So it's for entertainment primarily. The course I'm teaching right now, called Ludology of all things, is really about gamification and serious games and, you know, thinking about the ontology of games. Those are really good ways to peek at the edges. So they learn about that, and I tell them there's this market here, there's this employability here for that, but that's not our focus. The Laurier Conestoga program is about serious games, gamification, like that's their focus. I've been down there a few times, talked to their students. Most of them aren't as interested in working in the entertainment space. Right? They're interested in games and some other ways. So they work a lot more in the analog space than our students do. I assign analog assignments all the time, but that's not typical for our program. You know, Scott over there does escape rooms. Like they do all sorts of interesting things. That is, I think, unique. As far as I know, unique in North America. That they have a really interesting program over there, but it's just very different from ours. Ours is just here's a shot at becoming someone who works in the games industry, and that's really our focus. Mm-hmm.
Talk about the way you started teaching the students as multimodal in the focus. I'm wondering how you draw courses in. Is there, for example, a requirement if you're going to be doing art to have a fine arts or minor as part of this degree?
No, not at all. So
It's just sort of always games outward, I guess?
yeah, so the students will all take, like the BAs and the BSCs take a bunch of courses together. So the programming students need to take 3D modeling and learn about environment art. Likewise, the BAs do a little bit of programming. And then when they get into the project courses, they just self-select. Well, you know, I really like being an artist. That's really important, by the way, because again, that communication between disciplines is where things go awry. So giving everybody like a foundational knowledge and a little bit of everything, it just makes those conversations happen a lot smoother. You know, like don't ask the programmers to do like, if you're game design, do like 100 different systems in 6 weeks, right? Because you hopefully you know that's not feasible. Yeah, Neil?
How do I put this? What's the difference between a multimodal analysis of a game about racism and systemic racism and a film or TV show?
Mm-hmm.
This sounds a really stupid question.
No, it's not.
But based with your analytic framework,
Mm-hmm.
where do you actually
Yeah, I'll try to go back there.
demonstrate that this is a game,
I
not
think,
something else.
yeah, I think it's in that procedural column there, where, so like by the way, multimodal film analysis has been a thing for a long time, but the user, I mean, these are all, this is all gray area, but the user input is very limited in a film, right? The interpretation is open, but the way that the individual shots are put together once it's released, I can't really do anything with that. Right? In a game, well, I have a lot more interaction. I can choose to go into that, right? And I can choose to go into that that building or not, right? And going into it, I'm experiencing a model of the consequences. That's not the same as the real thing, obviously, but I'm experiencing a simulated model of it in a way that's different, I think. Just pressing the joystick and walking in there and seeing what happens is, I think, different than reading about it or watching it in a film. And I think multimodality has a lot to say in other media too, but this, everybody hates this word, but the interactive part of it, right? The thing that makes the avatar move, that's my decision.
So my question is about how interactive is it? Like, there's a difference between, if the only way to make the game progress is to press the button, button A, in order to open the door, that's not a lot different from watching a movie, right?
Right.
Because you're basically just, there's nothing else you can actually do.
Sure. Yeah, and it's not the same thing as flipping a page in a book. Yeah, so absolutely. I think it's a matter of degree. When I talk about interactivity, like, I don't say, games are the only interactive medium and books aren't interactive, but I think the degree to which, actually moving around, entering that or not, and then engaging with the systems is, like Mary Laura Ryan talks about, he puts it on a spectrum. There's high interactivity and low interactivity. And so I like this idea that games just typically, not always though, are more likely to have this high interactivity. And that's not for all games. Like, if you look at a Telltale game where it's just quick time events, that would probably be on the low spectrum of interactivity. But yeah, it's a tough question that there's no easy answer for, but I think the spectrum idea of interactivity and, how much control do I have? Am I changing ones to zeros and zeros to ones? I think that's still higher on that spectrum than just flipping a page and moving your eyes. Yes. Yeah, you have one more.
There's an interesting question about isolating modes and how that works when what you're talking about is a simulation and a model, as opposed to, say, a film where you can repeat that moment over and over again. Repeatability is higher.
Mm-hmm.
How do you assess, say, for example, if you're looking at sound? I'll probably read it later, I guess. But looking at sound in a game, do you do different sort of procedural things to have that sound repeat itself over and over again? Do you know what I mean by that? I can think of dissonant sort of things that could happen in a Grand Theft Auto game, for example, around when dialogue is delivered.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important to the sort of multimodal experience of that, because it happens in a certain moment, but it's not intended to necessarily.
Sure.
Something's triggered when it shouldn't be. That doesn't mean the dialogue is delivered poorly, that the actor did a poor job, there's anything sort of wrong with the sound on its own.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, anything emergent that happens, I do deal with that in the book. And looking back on it, there's a lot in the book that's like, okay, here's why this is really difficult. So here's the limitations of this. That's why the editor didn't like this, but I'm sure, but I talk about meaning potentials a lot. Because that's all, semiotics and rhetoric, all you can ever do is talk in potentials. Like, here's what I think is a viable interpretation, not what the player is going to think it means. So yeah, like open world games where a lot of emergent stuff happens and there's just all sorts of systems interacting with each other. Yeah, it's really tricky because one player is going to, in fact, have a very different experience and ensemble of modes than another player, right? It's just the way that it's going to be. So that said, it's not like we're not completely lost, right? Things have meaning. There's stock symbols that we all can agree on mean this or that. So we can say, we're not on completely solid foundations, but maybe firm. And so we can acknowledge that things are tricky and variable, but also say, well, here's at least a viable or a valid reading of it. Yeah,
So a couple of us play D&D together
Mhm.
a couple times a week. And so now I'm thinking about how we would sort of do a multimodal analysis of a role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons, particularly like how you would account for the mode of player interactions with one another and
Sure.
like a dungeon master.
Yeah, so D&D is a great example. So speech is probably where semiotic analysis would focus, I'd say, is the speech that happens between players and the DM. But certainly, sometimes, people, like the rule book sometimes has, images, and people sometimes draw their own characters and do all sorts of things. Sometimes people speak in a different voice, right, that mimics their character. So for me, it would probably be things like speech and gesture, maybe text, depending on, what people are using exactly. So yeah, I think it works. Again, my focus on video games just because they're so rich, they really use all of them kind of together. But I think it absolutely still works in board games and something like D&D, absolutely. Any sort of tabletop role-playing game, it would work for sure. Even something that's really interesting to me is fan art that comes out of like Friends of the Table, like different podcasts that are tabletop role-playing games or inspired by them, like all the fan art that comes out of them. That's really interesting to me. Nothing that the developers or the designers ever really intended, but just that the community creates, I think, is really interesting too. Yeah, I guess my short answer is speech and gesture and things like that. I'd focus on. Like clothes and fashion. Maybe people dress up. Like it depends how far people take it.
Okay.
All right. So it occurred to me that the controversies in the late 1970s about Dungeons and Dragons players that used to apparently kill themselves jumping off the roof and things like that. We had only done a multimodal analysis for the press and shown that, jumping off roofs is not actually a mode
There you go.
in D&D. Like, you're sitting around a table, speech only, so you can't do that.
Semiotics will save us.
All right. Thank you, Jason.
Thank
Great
you.
to have you back, and congratulations one more on your book and on the program that is becoming very successful, unquestionably. Thank you very much.
Thank you.